All right, I have 5 after. Gaia, do you want to go ahead and get started?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, great. Well, welcome everyone to the second session of Tax the Rich Everywhere, political education series organized by the Climate and Economic Subcommittee of DSA's International Committee and co-sponsored by the DSA National Political Education Committee. My name is Adam Ray, and along with Gaius Sriskantan, I'm one of the co-chairs of the Climate and Economics Subcommittee in the IC. We'd like to thank you for spending part of your Saturday with us, whether you're online or in person at the People's Forum in New York. If you're online, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your preferred pronouns, and where you're joining from. So the goal of this 3-part series is to understand the global tax regime and what we can do to deconstruct and transform it as activists and organizers in the country most responsible for creating and upholding this unfair and unjust global tax system. We're going to learn how it's structured to reinforce patterns of colonial exploitation and imperialism, how tax abuse imperils development and climate goals, and how social movements across the world are responding to this challenge. In our first session last month, we were joined by Sergio Chaparro Hernandez of De Justicia, who gave us a great overview of the global tax system. He talked about illicit flows, the extent of tax abuse through profit shifting and tax havens, and some of the current attempts to shift tax governance from the OECD to the UN. If you weren't able to attend the first session, make sure to check out the recording. We'll post that link in the chat and then also share it via email as well. This morning, we are honored to be joined by Chenai Mukumba. Chenai is based in Nairobi, Kenya, and is the Executive Director of Tax Justice Network Africa. Tax Justice Network Africa is a research and advocacy organization with the goal of leading and cohering tax justice voices across the continent. Through its Nairobi Secretariat, it collaborates closely with its member civil society organizations to curb illicit financial flows and promote progressive taxation systems. And in partnership and collaboration with other regional economic governance institutions, Tax Justice Network Africa advocates for tax policies with pro-poor outcomes and tax systems that curb public resource leakages and enhance domestic resource mobilization. Chenai has a master's in international relations from Wits University, Johannesburg, and is currently studying for a master's in taxation from Oxford. Chenai is going to discuss how we can mobilize tax justice for reparations, learning from both past and current efforts from international movements and campaigns for tax justice. She will explore what kind of world we can build with recovered tax revenue, using tax reform for climate reparations, and some of the different policy instruments for a just distribution of fiscal flows worldwide. Just a couple of quick ground rules before we get started. This session will be recorded, and the link will be shared once it's available. And we will have time for Q&A at the end of today's session. So if you're online, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom, not the chat, to submit any questions that you have. And if you're in the room, we'll do our best to moderate the Q&A and make sure everyone has the opportunity to ask questions. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Chenai. Chenai, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Adam. Good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be able to spend Saturday morning with you. Thank you so much for the invitation to share about some of the work that we do. It's always a real honor to be able to talk to those that aren't sort of fully engaged and entrenched in the work that we do, and sort of see the extent to which there's room for synergy, right, when it comes to these conversations. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to be using this PowerPoint as the basis for my presentation. And then, of course, I will be able to share that with yourselves shortly afterwards. Please, can I have a thumbs up or any sort of indication if you can see it? Fantastic. Thank you very much. All right, so let me put it onto PowerPoint view. All right, fantastic. Okay, so good morning again. As was mentioned by Adam, my name is Chenai Mukumba. I'm with the Tax Justice Network Africa. We are a regional network of civil society organizations, think tanks, women's rights organizations on the continent. We are currently based in Nairobi and have presence in 26 different African countries. The issue of tax justice for us is really sort of core and central to our work. We were established in 2015 when the launch of what at that time, and still is really, a seminal report was released. This was the high-level panel report of illicit financial flows out of Africa. And so this panel essentially oversaw the preparation of a report that was to look into this issue of illicit financial flows on the continent. Reason being, there had been a lot of information about the fact that Africa as a continent was incredibly rich, incredibly wealthy, but there seemed to be such a dissonance when that particular piece of information was juxtaposed to the reality on the continent. And so in 2015, a panel that was chaired by His Excellency Thabo Mbeki did some research to try and understand and probe into this question, and then put out this report, which really had some of the most interesting results that turned on its head a lot of the narrative of tax issues on the continent, specifically of illicit financial flows on that continent. So I'm not going to go too much into what illicit financial flows are, because I know Sergio did that I guess at the last session. But really what that report looked at was the amount of money that as a continent, Africa was losing based off of the amount of money that was being generated and what that meant for our development. So this report identified that first and foremost, we were losing as a continent close to $50 billion annually through illicit financial flows. Again, this amount, it was very clearly stated in this report, considered to be minimum, because of course this issue of illicit financial flows, money that's flowing out of the continent, has to be an estimate, right? Because a lot of it is happening illegally, right? Or very much hidden, and so it's difficult to get to a concrete figure. But what was most interesting about that report, apart from, you know, this incredible figure that it revealed, was that there were sort of three main reasons for these resources leaving the continent. So the first reason that was contributing to these resources leaving the continent was attributed to the behavior of some of the leaders within the continent, right? So corruption and various political activities. The second contributor to illicit financial flows on the continent was attributed to the activity of multinational corporations, right? So both tax avoidance and tax evasion activities. And then the third contributor was attributed to illegal activities, right? So drug trafficking, human trafficking, etc. But what it showed, and this was one of the most interesting thing about the report, is that of the three different reasons for the continent losing this insane amount of money, the primary reason was the activity of multinational corporations that were engaging in activity on the continent. They accounted for close to 2/3 of the amount of money that the continent was losing. And so what that did was upend, in a sense, this narrative that the continent was responsible for its own maldevelopment, that the leaders themselves were the ones that were the foremost ones who were to blame and to be responsible for the direction the continent was going and why these resources weren't being reinvested into the continent, and really showed that we had this problem of the activity of primarily global North corporations that were engaging in activities on the continent. And so as an institution, this was something that we thought was incredibly important to begin to highlight, because in order for us to address the problem, what we needed to do was make known what the true reason, right, for the losing of all of these resources from the continent was, primarily this activity of these multinational corporations on the continent. And what was also incredibly interesting about this report is that it showed that the continent was losing more through these illicit financial flows than it was gaining in terms of aid, in terms of foreign direct investments. And so in a sense, could be, and quite frankly, in the true sense, can be considered a net creditor to the world. When you take into account all of that which the continent is giving out to the global north and other regions vis-a-vis the amount of money that it is gaining in. So another report that was then released a few years ago actually indicated that unfortunately we've actually started to see an increase in this scourge of illicit financial flows. I'll refer to it a little bit later. But what I wanted to really lay the foundation for was why we were established as an institution, and why this topic, particularly for us as Africans and generally for the Global South, because Africa really can be said to be reflective of other regions as well, should be one of the issues that is front and foremost for us. So the first slide I'm showing you now is one of the diagrams that has been put out that actually shows you the amount of money that the continent is losing, and why, in a sense, it can be considered a net creditor. And so this report, this particular diagram was put out in the late 2000s, just trying to show that if you consider the amount of money that's coming into the continent vis-a-vis how much the continent is losing or giving out in debt repayments, is giving out in remittances and illegal logging, etc., truly it can be seen that in a sense, the continent, the African continent, is giving out a lot more than it is receiving. So I've been asked to speak to this question of tax justice as reparations. We've been doing work specifically within the climate context, looking at the way in which tax justice can be used as reparations within this particular field of work. And so that's what's going to be the basis of my presentation. I will outline the problem, and then I'll go into some of the solutions that we've been exploring as Tax Justice Network Africa. So I mentioned earlier that this initial report was put out in 2015, right? Just showing the scale of tax injustice on the continent. In 2020, another report was put out, and this one was released by the UN. And it actually showed that as a continent, there had been an almost doubling of the amount of money that we were losing. And so now estimates are closer to $89 billion. And almost half of that due to particularly our extractive sector. So particularly to the activities of multinational corporations that are on the continent and engaging in the extractive sector. One of the things that this report also shows you, that again, we're seeing the same trend of the amount of money that the continent is losing being more than the amount of money that we receive in terms of foreign direct investment, as well as overseas development assistance. So again, that point I was making earlier about the fact that the continent, and I want to extrapolate that and say the region, the Global South region, can be said to be a net creditor to the rest of the world as far as resources are concerned. And so I want to just point to a particular case study within the African continent. One of the countries that really sees significant tax injustice is the mineral-rich the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. And according to the 2021 State of Tax Justice report that was published by TJN, it indicated that this country was losing through corporate tax abuse close to $700 million. And when you consider the state of that particular country, when you consider the amount of poverty that exists within that country, all of these are resources that, if they were able to be retained within the continent, could set that country on a completely different developmental trajectory. But as I mentioned earlier, the activity of primarily multinational corporations in the mining center in this country, we're seeing a significant amount of these resources being funneled out, and thereby undermining any sort of progress that this country could achieve. And so I mentioned earlier that when we're thinking about reparations, our particular focus has been specifically within the climate space. And so when you take a look at who is responsible, right, for this climate disaster that we find ourselves in, you can see, if you take a look at that report that shows that showing that the darker red, right, is where we're seeing the most emissions, it's primarily the global north, right? And so you can see that particularly the global North, yes, but the American region as well as European region, as well as Australia there, that's where we're seeing the most pollution entering into our systems. And then, of course, what then is also most known is that the countries that are most susceptible to the negative effects of this climate are the ones that are least contributing, right, to what we're seeing. And so again, this map here, you can see the countries that are most vulnerable. And so you can see the African continent there with that deep purple and that deep red, showing the countries that are really bearing the brunt of the negative impact of these emissions. And what we've been seeing over the past couple of years have been these incredible droughts in certain countries. So for example, in Zambia, the president recently had to go on CNN and declare a state of emergency because there's been no rain for the entire year. And at the same time, we're seeing in countries such as South Africa, incredible flooding happening again as a result of this climate change. And across the continent, these stories are being told that are indicating that the result and the effect of the emissions that are taking place, particularly in the global north, are having these incredibly disastrous effects, particularly on the global south. And of course, I come from Africa, and so can speak to what that means here. And so something needs to be done to address this, right? And so this is part of what this particular presentation is going to speak to. I have this presentation, this slide as well, that also juxtaposes two different things. We can also see that the biggest tax abusers, as I mentioned to earlier, are the same ones that are also responsible for the largest emissions. And so I know Sergio in his presentation in the previous session of this would have indicated how that tax abuse is happening. And what I want to show in this particular slide is that the countries that are being most affected by global tax abuse are also the ones that are being most affected by the negative impacts of climate, right? And so this is showing you, for example, the money that's being lost as a percentage of public health spending, just as an example, right? And so it's showing you that particularly lower income countries, the amount of money that's being lost as a percentage of health spending is close to 50%, right? And of course, this has the most negative effects on women and children. And the amount of money that's being lost already means that we're seeing many countries not being able to provide this service. And this is only being further exacerbated by the further worsening of the situation of countries that's happening as a result of climate change. And so what are some of the solutions that we've been thinking about at TJNA to address this issue of climate change? And so what I'm going to do is sort of walk you through the different potential solutions we've been looking at, and then focus on the reparations component that essentially is the crux of this presentation. So at TJNA, when we talk about tax justice, what we're taking a look at is the potential of countries to be able to raise resources domestically, right? And when we're talking about tax, what we recognize is that it can play a number of different functions. So I won't go into too much detail again, because I know this was referred to in the last section, but tax can play 5 different functions. Number 1, it potentially can raise revenue, right? Number 2, it's also able to play this redistributive role, right? Of taking resources and redistributing it to those who have less of it. Thirdly, tax can also play this function of repricing, right? Adjusting the prices of different services or goods in an economy in order to adjust behavior. Tax can also play this function of improving representation, right? So for example, it's actually been shown that countries that have higher tax to GDP rates tend to have more democratic societies, right? So there's that interesting role of tax. And then also, tax can also play the function of contributing to reparations. So as far as this conversation is concerned, vis-a-vis the climate justice question, tax, if done well, if we are able to address this issue of illicit financial flows so that we are retaining resources within the continent, we can see tax being able to contribute to the raising of revenue within the countries that generate this revenue, right? And so essentially what you then see is governments having the resources that they would need in order to direct it to areas that most need interventions to address this climate crisis, right? And so essentially tax can effectively mobilize climate finance for developing countries, right? But the extent to which we have issues of tax abuse and tax avoidance, this undermines government's abilities to do so, right? And so again, going back to the tax justice question, seeing the extent to which we can close these loopholes, seeing the extent to which we can address this issue of multinational corporations funneling resources out of this country is a key way of addressing this particular climate crisis question. Again, tax can be used as a function for redistribution, right? And so essentially, tax revenue can be used to address environmental and climate-related community challenges. Again, so the extent to which we can mitigate, minimize, reduce, and ideally eradicate all of the activities of multinational corporations happening within the continent can then see governments effectively use this particular function of tax, right, to address many of these challenges that are happening at the community level, right, to ensure that it is putting in place redistributive policies that benefit the citizens that are often the ones being most negatively affected by this. And then we see representation, right? The extent to which tax is able to fully play its function of representation means you can actually start to see citizens begin to hold their governments to account to ensure that they're addressing these different issues, right? And so this representation question happens at two levels. One, the national level that I just spoke to as well, but also needs to happen at another level where discussions on global tax governance are happening. I'll talk to it a little bit later, but I also know Sergio referred to it. African countries, global South countries are not at present engaging or participating in global level tax discussions. And as a result, their views, perspectives, needs, priorities are not reflective in the decisions that are made at that level. And so it's so important to understand this particular role of tax as well. And now this is essentially where I'm going to focus, right? Which is the function that tax can play as far as contributing to reparations. And so I indicated earlier that the primary contributors to pollution, the polluters, are the ones who, when you take a look at that map, were former colonizers, right? And are also the same ones who are responsible for a lot of the tax avoidance and tax evading behaviors that are happening at the continent. And the reason we need to look at the reparations question is because reparation can help address, first of all, the historical legacies, right, of colonization that are in large part responsible for where the continent is today, as well as the ecological damage that is happening now due to the current global international landscape. And so the question of rich countries being the largest emitters, right, where the most extractive multinational corporations are headquartered, is one that must be looked at to be providing compensation to developing countries for the historical carbon emissions that are the ones that are giving developing countries these severe negative climate change impacts, despite the fact that they're not the ones that are responsible for this. And it's important to realize that this is important to consider when you factor into the conversation that recognition of this has happened, but there has been a failure to meet the climate finance pledges over the years to address this. And so we need to be looking at a different tool to address this issue. Now, the question of tax as a tool for reparations is not new. And when I was doing some reading around this, and when we were doing research around this, came across a really interesting bit of information. It was only in 2015 that taxpayers in the UK stopped paying back a debt that had been taken by the government to pay slave trade owners as reparations for the slaves that they lost as a result of the end of slave trade. So often when you're talking about taxes reparations, a lot of people consider this to be a new concept, consider it to be perhaps not even something that people who are talking about tax should be considering. But the reason I want to flag this is because it's actually not a new thing, even though it's coming to the fore now as a result of the climate change question. It's actually been used previously, as I'm just indicating here, in the UK. And so I think whilst the actual reparations that were being paid back is very questionable, the point I'm trying to make is that governments have, in fact, used tax as reparations before. And so it's a tool that can be used now and should be used now to address this climate change question. And so what are we proposing when we're talking about tax as reparations, particularly to help us address this climate change issue? So first and foremost, this question on carbon tax. So the wealthiest 1% emits as much planet heating pollution as 2/3 of humanity. And as everybody knows, the bulk of humanity can be found within the global south. And this is only going to increase over time. And so the basis for the carbon tax is that those who are emitting the most carbon should be the ones that are paying for it. And so a carbon tax would be progressive in the sense that it is being levied on the wealthiest multimillionaires and billionaires to hold them to account, to hold them responsible, and to have them be the ones that are addressing the issue that they themselves caused. And so a report by Oxfam estimated that an annual wealth tax of up to 5%, just 5%, on the world's multimillionaires and billionaires could raise up to $1.7 trillion, which is enough to lift 2 billion people out of poverty and also create a significant dent in addressing this climate change issue. And so what does this mean? If 20%, just say 20% of this 1.7 trillion was earmarked for climate, that would mean $340 billion available for climate action. Now, I'm going to draw you back to those initial numbers that I had said the continent is losing in illicit financial flows, right? I said in 2015, we were losing $50 billion annually. And now increasingly what we're seeing is that because we haven't yet fully addressed this issue of illicit financial flows, because the activities of multinational corporations are beginning to become much more complex and complicated, we've seen an address. But if we were able to put in place just this carbon tax, we would immediately see $340 billion available for climate action. So whilst we still need to be addressing this issue of illicit financial flows, there is a way in which we can start to mitigate the negative impact of that loss and have that loss be paid by those who are the ones that are responsible for the crisis that we're seeing, particularly in the global south region. This $340 billion is more than 6 times Africa's climate adaptation needs, which currently are standing at $53 billion. So perhaps there's a world in which we say, yes, pledges, hold the pledges, and ensure that people are doing those. That's something that we need to continue to do. But there's a world in which if we were to put in place a tax, particularly on the wealthiest, that was essentially being drawn and then contributed and then directed towards where it's most needed, we could see an addressing of that particular issue. Now, I've spoken about a climate tax, which is particularly important and something that we've been exploring. But another type of tax that's also being discussed and has a long history as a potential way of using tax for reparations is a financial transaction tax. The reason I flagged this is because the Kenyan president a few months ago actually made reference to this, perhaps we need to consider putting in place a financial transaction tax as a way to also begin to use tax as reparations, to also begin to see the extent to which we can have the wealth that's being concentrated in the north. And then if you remember my earlier statement, in large part, having been extracted and drawn from the global south, having that be drawn in order to help address a lot of the needs that are on the continent. So what is a financial transaction tax? It's a levy that is imposed on financial instruments, right? So stocks, bonds, derivatives. And essentially what this would be is a very small tax that's charged, very small percentage that's charged on the transaction value. And so to give you an example, in 2021, the average daily value traded was 15.8 trillion across the commodities markets, across the equity markets, across foreign currency markets, and across fixed income markets. And what an FTT would do would target the financial system in an effort to achieve reparatory justice, right? Including climate action, right? A lot of it, what's being drawn from that could also be used to address this issue. 1% tax on just that, 1% tax on just that 15.8 daily value could essentially raise $158 billion that could be used as resources to address many of the issues that are quite prevalent on the continent, and would be more than sufficient resources that are required to address the climate finance action, a lot of the adaptation that's required, as well as the sustainable development goals. And so as I come to an end with my presentation, there's a couple of things that I want to flag. Whilst tax as a tool for reparations is something that we've explored, something that's been used before, as I mentioned earlier, and something that is quite important. What we also need to be considering is a much more systemic overhaul of the way our current global tax system works, in order to mitigate the negative impacts of what's currently happening as a result of climate change, but also to mitigate the maldevelopment that's happening, particularly in the global south. The future of tax justice for climate change is going to be greatly impacted, right, by the way in which we're able to address these broader systemic issues. These systemic issues that are underpinned by the historical imbalances of current tax rules that are at presently biased against global south countries and in favor of global north countries. I know Sergio referred to this earlier, but I'm just going to double click on it because I think it's really important. What I've just been referring to now is what we can do to use tax as a tool for reparations within the current system. But there's another conversation that also needs to be had about perhaps the system itself is the problem, and we need to address the global tax system as a whole. Now, whilst systemic reform questions often tend to be lofty, we actually find ourselves at a situation where something like this may become a reality. The global tax rules are currently overseen, determined by what's called the OECD Inclusive Framework. Now, the OECD Inclusive Framework, the OECD began to oversee the global tax rules in the 1960s. And at that point, it was really the 38 countries that were in the room and able to decide what the global tax rules should be. Back in the 1960s, many African countries, many global south countries weren't even in existence. And so they had no say with regards to the development of those rules. And when they began to gain independence and essentially want to contribute more to these conversations, this was when the OECD then, in a sense, closed down the space, the more democratic space where these conversations were being had at the League of Nations, and pick up these discussions at the OECD. Now, when I talk about systemic reform and what's happening now, 2 years ago, the Africa Group tabled a resolution that was then adopted at the UN to say we need to see a shifting of where conversations on global tax rules happen. Right now, they're happening at the OECD. And at the OECD Inclusive Framework, whilst it's called inclusive because they've expanded it due to demand from developing countries to allow more developing countries to participate, even then, 50% of African countries still don't participate in that platform. And so we need to see that entire conversation happen in a much more democratic and inclusive space. And so right now, there's discussions happening that will hopefully lead in a UN tax convention, which is essentially an agreement at the UN that is going to start to see decisions being made at the UN, the governance of global tax rules being made at the UN, where developing countries are able to share their concerns, share their needs, share their priorities, and have those influence the global tax regime, the global tax system. So I say that to indicate that we need to and should be prioritizing the use of tax as reparations to address our current and most urgent needs. But at the same time, we also need to be supporting the more systemic reform conversations that are happening, that are being led by global South countries, that indicate that right now, the current tax system that we have is unfairly in favor of particularly the countries that I mentioned were in the room in the 1960s when these discussions were being had, so that we can start to democratize those questions. And on that point, I'm going to wrap up. I hope that was clear and happy to answer any questions. Thanks, Adam, Gaia, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chenai. So we definitely have a few minutes for Q&A. I'll remind everyone, you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom to submit questions. And then also in the room, I think we're going to have Gaia sort of moderate there. So I guess I'll start kind of the point that you closed on about this needing to be kind of a more broad and kind of systematic change. I guess I kind of see like the global tax system and efforts to reform that as being underpinned by the reality that much of the wealth is owned by multinational corporations. And so that's kind of why, there's so much financial outflow from Africa. What's the relationship between efforts to change the tax system and efforts to kind of bring resources under democratic control domestically within Africa? I mean, broadly, you could call it like nationalization, I guess.
Yeah. So right now, I'll give you an example. When countries sign, so for example, double taxation agreements, right, which are essentially agreements that determine which country is going to be able to tax, companies that are operating in those countries. The model that's often used as a basis for that agreement is the OECD model. And the OECD model actually has very clear benefits for multinational, for countries that are the source of where those multinational corporations are based, right? Almost in response to that, the UN developed an alternative model, right, that can also be used as a basis for when countries are using this, which tries to even the playing field, right, so that both source and residence countries are able to sort of share the taxing rights. So that's just an example of, you can see the clear bias of the outcome of a conversation based off of where it was had, right? Because at the OECD, you see a very clear model tax convention that benefits the OECD countries, richer developed countries. And then you see an alternative that was developed at the UN, where you have developing countries present in the room, that actually shows you a model that has much more equitable taxing rights, right? And so essentially this conversation about systemic reform is a question about shifting where conversations are had to spaces that are much more democratic, much more inclusive, so that you then have much more fair, much more inclusive outcomes, right? And so that's the bigger reform question that needs to be had. Whilst, as I was saying earlier, conversations also need to be had around, in our current system, because it's going to take a while, what can we also be doing to help address some of those injustices already?
Okay, so I guess to follow up kind of with that question, we have a question online, which is, what can a US-based organization like DSA do to be most helpful to support the pursuit of a UN tax treaty? And could you talk a little bit more about the scope and vision of the UN tax treaty?
Okay. The first thing I think that would be really helpful is when the voting was happening last year on this UN resolution that's supposed to lead towards a UN tax convention, the US was one of the countries that voted against it. The US and a number of other developed countries, the UK, for example. What would be incredibly helpful is to begin to see more support being reflected by different constituents within the US in order to have their governments begin to change their position on this conversation. So I think I would say that that's the biggest thing. And so what's happening right now at the UN, because essentially it still went through. The UN is democratic, so it's one country, one vote. And so, the countries that are in favor of this reform are the ones that then saw it be pushed through. What's happening now is the development of the terms of reference. And this is really supposed to be the document that's supposed to serve as, I guess, the TORs for the actual convention itself, which will hopefully most likely begin to be developed next year. Already we saw, I think in February, tensions between the developing countries that really want this to move forward and developed countries that are benefiting from the current status quo and quite frankly would like to see it that way, right? And so I think for me, one of the things that we could see that would be most helpful, particularly from this committee, would be putting pressure on the US government to say, if we say that democracy is an undergirding principle nationally, why would it not be something that we promote and want to push for at an international level? If we say we want to see much more fair, sort of equitable development and distribution of wealth, right? Why would we not want to see processes that can contribute and lead to that? So I think that's what I would say would be most helpful.
Guy, do we have any questions from the room?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, maybe we can take a couple. So we have KTB and Kayla. So KTB, if you don't know this.
Sure. Thank you so much, Chenai. That was awesome and really informative. I'm really interested in the financial transactions tax that you mentioned and spoke about. I would love if you could tell us more about if that was going to be applied, would it happen at the country level or internationally? And then what are the mechanisms through which the revenues of that could be distributed to the most climate vulnerable countries and communities within countries as well?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So there's a lot of conversation about how that could happen. Essentially, we would need to see an institution at the global level, right? And that's sort of supranational, that's able to oversee and facilitate that. And then the revenues of that then be directed to, of course, I'm talking here about climate, the countries that are most in need of that, which could be identified using the climate sort of vulnerability index. And so in a sense, we would need to see perhaps this situated at the UN, right? When thinking about different fora, the UN right now is the one that actually allows for all countries to have a say and contribute to decision-making, right? Vis-a-vis, for example, IMF or World Bank, where there's a quota system that sort of unfairly positions sort of developing countries. And so it would need to be something that's supranational. The UN is a potential place where that could be. And then the distribution of those resources based off of need, right? Based off of countries that are really being seen to be most in want of resources to help them address the climate change issue.
Hello.
So I was just wondering if there's anything to say about China, because I know that like they have people talk about like the Belt and Road Initiative, and I feel like they probably have a similar interest in extracting money from the continent, but I also wonder if they like if their position makes them like more sympathetic to like the wanting to make things more democratic or whatnot.
So you're right. I think China's in a very interesting position in that. So first of all, maybe let me answer the second question first. G77 and China as a voting bloc in the UN is actually in support of the UN tax convention. And so we are, in a sense, seeing support by them for that more democratic process that's happening at the UN. Having said that, China is also a big contributor to a lot of the sort of extraction and subsequent implications of climate change that we are seeing on the continent, and also would therefore be one of the countries that we also think needs to be responsible when considering the different countries that need to be taxed in this sense, right, to help address the issues that are happening on the continent.
I have a question, and also please, like, we have this amazing resource here, so please, even if you have a question that feels stupid, like, do ask it, because it's a great opportunity. Chenai, thanks so much for this, and I was just wondering that, you know, I know that there are movements in the Caribbean looking at reparations for all the wealth that was extracted via slavery. I'm just wondering how the tax justice climate movement looking at reparations and tax, it intersects with that, and if there's any connection between those projects, and also if you know of other movement efforts on reparations that are taking a similar or slightly divergent view from the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of really incredible work that's happening in Latin America. So whilst you've flagged, I think there's a lot of work to try and address reparations of the slave trade. And I do know, I think it must have been last year, where there was actually a meeting that was held in Ghana, where a number of leaders from Latin America were interacting with a number of leaders on the continent to begin to answer this reparations question, right? To help unpack what that means, first of all, and then secondly, what sort of then ensuring that it can happen, right? Looks like. So there are different conversations that are happening at the moment. I know the president of Ghana actually is a champion on this, and it was the one who held the meeting last year. I think it was in the third quarter of the year, must have been like in October or so. And so happy to share more information about that. But I think just to flag that shared history, that shared experience is definitely something that's tying the two different regions together. And in a sense, beginning to bolster that reparations question as far as the slave trade is concerned. And then I think on the climate change question, we've definitely seen global South countries coming together as far as this is concerned. So we, for example, as a civil society organization, work very closely with what our Latin American partner is doing. Well, our Latin American partner, they're called Red de Justicia Fiscal. They're also doing quite a lot of work on climate change as well, and essentially how to use tax as a tool for reparations within that space. And so we've been interacting and sharing experience about, you know, the different ways that can look like. But I think that the bottom line is the shared histories that we have, the colonial legacies, bring together and bind the global South so that we have very similar approaches to the work that we're doing. I mean, they may change a little bit in terms of how they're outworked, but we definitely exchange a lot of ideas around what that could look like.
I have one more question, but anyone else? Okay,
Maybe
yeah.
a small, yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I just was curious about how, because the Warsaw mechanism for loss and damage, very specific about how it's not a tool for reparations. But I'm wondering if how you see your work with tax justice linking up to loss and damage broadly, given that facility already kind of exists and is being talked about at the UN level.
Yeah. I mean, I think we would see what we're currently proposing. We see it as complementary to some of the already existing efforts that are happening. I think we definitely push for much more ambition within the conversations that are happening at the UN. Loss and damage, I mean, it shocks us, right, that it's not already front and center of conversations. But I think as we see this discussion about tax as a tool for reparations being something that can be considered complementary to already existing efforts that are happening, that we also just think need to be bolder, right, to address the crisis that we have at hand.
Okay, my final question was just about narratives, because I mean, I think we've seen in the last, it's interesting, I think as the reparation movement is getting a little stronger, we're also seeing that kind of arms race thing happening where in the global north, the pushback against it is stronger. And like, I know that the dialogue in the UK is horrendous right now. You know, you have people like aligned to the government trying to make a case that slavery was a good thing, you know, like it's totally insane. So I'm just wondering, like, what do you see as the battle to create a unifying message that gets working class people on board in the UK? And I really liked that and was horrified by that fact that you gave us that until 2015, people in the UK have been paying slave owners reparations. Like, how do you, I do feel like we have a narrative battle to win here as well. And have you seen examples of that being done well? And what are your thoughts on that and how we can do better?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is that the question around reparations, right, is really a question around how we can even out development, right? How we can increase and improve the standard of living for everybody, right? And when you're able to do that, everybody benefits, right? I'll give you an example. Countries that have the highest inequality are countries that also the most unstable, right? That also have some of the highest sort of socioeconomic related issues and concerns. This needs to be understood to be the same thing at the global level as well, right? So, for example, we've seen an increase in migration, right, which has become an incredibly politically issue, particularly in the UK and other European countries. Why is that happening, right? In large part because African countries don't have the resources to provide their citizens with basic services, right? Or we're seeing conflicts that are taking place that are being fueled by sort of the race for resources, or issues along those lines. So it needs to be seen as something that will contribute to the betterment of the entire world, right? Not as something that's only going to benefit a particular group, a particular set of nations, right? We saw in COVID that you can't clearly, right, delineate where issues are happening and where the consequences are going to be felt. Now, we live in a very interrelated world. And so we need to start to see ourselves as a global community in that sense. And so I think that's the narrative that needs to be pushed forward. Even, for example, in the work that we've been doing around tax, it's being read, it's being seen as, oh, you're trying to take away resources from the rich countries and give it to the poor. It needs to be seen very differently. We're trying to create a community, a global community that works for the betterment of everyone. And then when you consider the people that are currently benefiting from the skewed tax system that we have right now, it's really a small marginal 1%. What we're trying to do is actually more equitably distributed these resources across everybody. And so I think that's the narrative we need to start pushing. A less zero sum, right? And more positive potential outcome for everybody.
We're going to do one more question from online and then wrap up. And I actually think this one follows pretty naturally. So from the online Q&A, in the US, we have an environmental justice movement which organizes communities of color and low-income communities around the fact that health and other burdens of pollution and climate disruption are concentrated where those communities live. Does your organization connect with such groups? More broadly, could linking such groups to struggles for global climate and redistributive justice be a useful strategy? And also, does a reparations narrative offer some opportunities for building those links?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the better connections between the different institutions that are working on this, the better, because I think a lot of the lessons and experiences are shared. Do we do that? Not yet. I mean, it would be amazing to link up with some of the communities that are being referred to there. I definitely think that this work provides an opportunity to connect such groups, and I think it can only work to sort of better consolidate and build the movement, right? That's working on these issues.
Okay, Guy, do we have any other questions, or do you think we should wrap up? Okay, well, I would just like to take this opportunity to thank Chenai again for spending time with us. This is fantastic and informative. And just one quick note, I'm pasting in the chat the link to the recording of the first session that Sergio did, as well as the RSVP for the third and final session of this series, which will be in about a month on April 27th. And so with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending and hope everyone has a good rest of your weekend. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation again.
Thank you.